This case is one of the most horrifying I have ever come across. A story so cruel and unjust, it must not be forgotten. If this story affected you, subscribe to the channel so you don't miss more true crime cases. Leave a comment to what are your thoughts on this case. Should stories like this be shared to spread awareness? Let's discuss.
The 911 dispatcher's voice crackled through the phone line, calm yet urgent. "What's your emergency?" The answer came from a panicked woman. "There's a child not breathing," she stammered. The responders rushed to an apartment in Seaside, Oregon. Inside, they were met with silence, broken only by suppressed weeping. In a dimly lit bedroom, they found 2-year-old Evangelina Wing lying motionless on her side. Her small body was covered with bruises, discoloration around her neck, and dried blood in her ears. She was already in full rigor mortis. It wasn't just her lifeless state that haunted the medics. It was the story her injuries told. Bite marks, burns, and broken bones painted a grim picture of suffering and torment. How could someone let this happen to a child? Seaside, Oregon, a peaceful coastal town known for its quiet beaches, was now the setting for an alarming tragedy. Evangelina had lived here with her mother, Dorothy Wing, and her 2 young brothers. Dorothy, a single mother working to provide for her family, seemed like any other parent struggling to make ends meet. But just weeks before Evangelina's death, a new figure entered their lives. Dorothy met Randy Roden, a man with a troubling past, and within a week of their meeting, she invited him to move in. Randy quickly took on the role of caregiver while Dorothy worked long hours. To the outside world, this might have seemed like a partnership forged out of necessity, but inside the apartment, a disturbing reality was taking shape. At first glance, Evangelina's death seemed like a tragic accident. Dorothy claimed her daughter had fallen off the toilet a few days earlier. But as investigators dug deeper, they uncovered a horrifying pattern of abuse that spanned months. Evangelina's death was not an isolated incident. It was the culmination of sustained brutality inflicted not only on her, but also on her 2 brothers. This was not just a story of a single act of violence, but of systemic failure, manipulation, and the unimaginable cruelty that turned a once loving home into a house of horrors. What unfolded would go down as one of the most shocking child abuse cases in Clatsop County's history, leaving a community shattered and searching for answers. But before we begin, I want to thank you, my amazing viewers and subscribers, for your support through your likes, shares, and comments. Your engagements help make these stories more meaningful. If you're new here, be sure to hit that subscribe button and join our growing community of true crime enthusiasts. Now let's get started, shall we? Evangelina Wing, born on January 22, 2011, was the kind of child who lit up a room with her smile. She had big, curious eyes and a laugh that made everyone admire her. Evangelina's world was small but filled with love, centered around her siblings, a 5-year-old brother who adored her, and a younger brother who shared her boundless energy. Together, the 3 children formed a tight-knit trio, their laughter often resounding through the modest apartment they called home in Seaside, Oregon. Dorothy Wing, their mother, worked tirelessly to provide for them. A single parent, she juggled long hours and limited resources, but she made sure her children never felt unloved. But beneath the surface, cracks in the family's fragile stability were beginning to show. Dorothy was exhausted. Balancing work and parenting alone had taken its toll. And while she hid it well, those closest to her knew she longed for companionship, for someone to share the burden of raising her children. So, in the fall of 2014, Dorothy met Randy Roden. Their paths crossed unexpectedly, and Dorothy saw in Randy what she believed was a ray of hope. He was charming, attentive, and seemed eager to step into the role of a father figure for her children. For a woman who had been navigating the muddy waters of single motherhood alone, Randy's interest felt like a lifeline. But what Dorothy didn't know, or perhaps chose not to see, was the darkness hidden beneath Randy's surface. Randy Roden had a past steeped in violence and control. His criminal record included charges of domestic violence, sexual assault, and kidnapping. He had a history of manipulating and abusing women, leaving behind a trail of broken lives. Yet he had a way of masking his true nature, presenting himself as the answer to a struggling single mother's prayers. Within a week of meeting, Randy moved into Dorothy's small apartment. It was a whirlwind decision that raised eyebrows among neighbors, but Dorothy seemed determined to make it work. She told friends that Randy made her feel safe, that he was good with the kids, that maybe, just maybe, things were finally turning around for her family. Randy wasted no time integrating himself into the family's daily life. With Dorothy working long hours to make ends meet, he quickly became the primary caregiver. At first, it seemed like a blessing, so much so that Dorothy began to rely on him, finding comfort in the idea that she wasn't alone anymore. But Randy's help came with strings attached. He started making decisions without consulting Dorothy, asserting control over the household. His temper flared at the smallest inconveniences, though he was careful to direct his anger when Dorothy wasn't around. The children, once carefree and full of life, began to withdraw. The changes were subtle at first. Neighbors noticed that the children, once so lively, were now rarely seen playing outside. When they did venture out, there were hints of trouble, a bruise on Evangelina's arm, the 5-year-old walking with a limp. When asked, Dorothy would wave off concerns, saying the kids were just clumsy. Inside the apartment, the signs of neglect and abuse were becoming impossible to ignore. Arguments between Dorothy and Randy grew louder, spilling through the thin walls of their building. The once warm and welcoming home became a place of fear and control. Evangelina, the vibrant little girl who once danced to music in the living room, grew quiet. She clung to her siblings, her laughter replaced by a fearful silence. Her brothers, too young to fully understand what was happening, began to bear the physical scars of Randy's presence. By December 2014, the calamity that had been building up within the Wing household was reaching its breaking point. Evangelina's light was fading, and the bruises were no longer something that could be explained away. The events that followed would expose the horrifying reality of life inside that apartment, and leave a community grappling with the question, how did it come to this? The details of the abuse is almost unbelievable, and so heartbreaking, really. Evangelina's once smooth, soft skin was now a patchwork of bruises, cuts, and discoloration. The medical examiner would later describe the injuries as discoloration around her neck that hinted at strangulation, blood pooling in her earlobes, and bite marks on every one of her tiny fingers. She was missing a fingernail on each hand, the result of either direct trauma or prolonged abuse. Her left arm, broken from shoulder to wrist, had been wrapped loosely in an ace bandage. Beneath the wrap, the humerus bone was twisted into a spiral fracture, an injury experts attributed to someone violently yanking and twisting her arm. Seriously, who does this to a child? But the horror didn't stop there. Evangelina's brothers were not spared Randy's wrath. Her 5-year-old brother was found with deep bruises covering his body, healing burns on his ears and nose, and a fractured pelvis, an injury rare even in high-impact trauma cases. His scalp bore lesions, and both of his eyes were swollen shut, with internal hemorrhaging that medical experts said was consistent with direct blows to the face. The 2-year-old brother also suffered severe injuries, including multiple bruises, swelling on his face, and a puncture wound inside his mouth that caused air to seep into the tissue of his jaw. His injuries painted a horrifying picture of deliberate, sustained violence. The children's accounts provided further insight into the nightmare they endured. When questioned by police, the 5-year-old described being chained up like a dog inside the apartment. The chains left raw marks on his wrists and ankles, and the boys spoke of being locked in their room for hours, sometimes days, without food or water. Randy's methods were not just violent. They were calculated, designed to break the children physically and emotionally. Honestly, no child should ever have to endure this. It's inhumane, truly one of the worst cases imaginable. The apartment itself reflected the horror within. Toys lay abandoned in corners, untouched and forgotten. The air carried a sour stench of neglect, unwashed clothes, rotting food, and the lingering odor of fear. The walls seemed to absorb the children's cries, muffling the evidence of Randy's control. Evangelina, once a joyful and lively toddler, began to fade. She no longer danced or laughed. Her bright eyes, once full of curiosity, now seemed empty, reflecting the weight of her suffering. She clung to her siblings, finding what little comfort she could in their shared pain. But even their bond could not shield her from the escalating abuse. While Randy's cruelty left physical scars, Dorothy's inaction cemented her role in the tragedy. At first, Dorothy may have believed Randy's explanations. The bruises were accidents, the burns were from clumsy play. But as the injuries became impossible to ignore, her silence grew deafening. Dorothy's background revealed a woman struggling with her own demons. As a single mother, she was overwhelmed by the demands of raising 3 children on her own. Randy entered her life like a lifeline, offering the support she desperately craved. But his help came with a cost. He quickly established control, manipulating Dorothy with a combination of charm and intimidation. In imagined inner monologues, Dorothy might have wrestled with her guilt and fear. This isn't right. But what can I do? I can't do this alone. The kids need a father figure, don't they? Randy's influence eroded her confidence, leaving her paralyzed and unable to act. Neighbors occasionally heard arguments through the thin apartment walls. Randy's voice would boom, followed by Dorothy's meek protests. But these moments of resistance were short-lived. Dorothy's fear of Randy, or perhaps her own denial, kept her complicit. She allowed Randy to discipline the children, ignored their cries, and turned a blind eye to their injuries. Whether out of fear, dependence, or apathy, Dorothy failed to protect her children when they needed her most. By December 2014, Evangelina's small body was giving out. She had become increasingly lethargic, her energy drained by the relentless abuse. Her injuries made it difficult to move, let alone play with her siblings. Her appetite diminished, and she spent most of her time lying down, unable to muster the strength to engage with the world around her. On December 19, 2014, Evangelina was visibly unwell. She had no energy to eat or play. Dorothy noticed but did nothing, likely dismissing her condition as exhaustion or a mild illness. Randy, as always, was dismissive. He brushed off Dorothy's concerns, telling her to let Evangelina rest. That night, Evangelina was put to bed in Dorothy's room. In the early hours of December 20, 2014, Dorothy found her daughter unresponsive. Evangelina's tiny body was cold and stiff, her face marked by bruises and discoloration. Dorothy called 911, her voice trembling with panic. "My daughter isn't breathing." When emergency responders arrived, they were met with a scene that would haunt them forever. Evangelina's lifeless body lay on her side, bruised and battered, in full rigor mortis. The visible signs of abuse told a story of sustained violence, neglect, and suffering. As investigators began to piece together the truth, it became clear that Evangelina's death was not a tragic accident, but the result of months of unimaginable cruelty. This level of pain and cruelty can move anyone to tears, evoking both deep empathy and intense anger against any form of child abuse. But the nightmare didn't end there. In another room, 2 small boys sat silently on a worn mattress. Their eyes, once bright with the innocence of childhood, now stared blankly into the distance. The 5-year-old's face was terribly swollen, his eyes almost completely shut from internal hemorrhaging. Burn marks marred his ears and nose, and his pelvis had been fractured, an injury doctors would later describe as horrifyingly rare in children. The 2-year-old, barely more than a baby, bore bruises across his body and a puncture wound in his mouth, evidence of unspeakable cruelty. The responders quickly realized the danger these children were still in. The boys were immediately removed from the apartment and rushed to Randall Children's Hospital for medical evaluations. Meanwhile, Dorothy and Randy were taken into custody. Dorothy appeared disoriented, a mix of fear and guilt flashing across her face. Randy, by contrast, was without remorse. His disposition cold and unbothered, as if this were just another day. The authorities knew they were dealing with more than a tragic accident. This was the face of calculated, methodical abuse, a reality far darker than they had imagined. The investigation began in earnest, with the autopsy on Evangelina shedding light on the horrors she had endured. The medical examiner meticulously catalogued her injuries, each one a shocking confirmation to months of abuse. The cause of death was blunt force trauma to the head. Her small skull bore signs of hemorrhaging, and her brain showed swelling consistent with a catastrophic concussion. These injuries weren't just recent. They were inflicted with brutal, deliberate force. What could she have done to deserve this? This level of pain is unbearable even for an adult, and the worst cases of torture in prisons are nothing in comparison to this. Evangelina's left arm had been twisted into a spiral fracture, an injury doctors explained could only occur if someone had violently yanked and twisted her arm. The bite marks on her fingers, adult-sized impressions, were horrifying evidence of the sadistic torment she suffered. Her fingernails had been ripped from her hands, exposing raw, tender flesh beneath. The autopsy also revealed discoloration around her neck and broken capillaries in her eyes, suggesting she had been strangled at some point. Her body was a roadmap of suffering, with bruises, lacerations, and scars in various stages of healing. This wasn't an isolated act of violence. It was systematic torture. The evaluations of her brothers were equally horrifying. The 5-year-old's injuries included a fractured pelvis, burns on his nose and ears, and lesions on his scalp. His face was swollen and bruised, his eyes damaged from repeated blows. The 2-year-old had a puncture wound in his mouth, bruising on his face and torso, and older injuries that had never been treated. The medical team at Randall Children's Hospital was unanimous. These children had been living in hell. With the evidence mounting, the police turned their focus to Dorothy and Randy. Dorothy was charged with manslaughter and criminal mistreatment, her inaction seen as complicity in the abuse. Randy faced charges of murder, manslaughter, assault, and criminal mistreatment. Search warrants revealed further evidence of the abuse. Bloodstains were found on clothing, and neighbors reported hearing screams and shouting from the apartment. Investigators also found chains that Randy used to restrain the children, a sad confirmation of the boys' accounts of being chained like dogs. Dorothy, during her interviews, painted a picture of a woman broken by manipulation and fear. She admitted to seeing the injuries but claimed she felt powerless to act. "I didn't know what to do," she told police, but her excuses rang hollow against the overwhelming evidence of her failure to protect her children. The discovery of Evangelina's body and the forensic evidence marked the beginning of a case that would shock the nation. As a shock, the sentence captures strong emotion but can be refined for clarity and impact. But as the legal battle loomed, one question lingered in everyone's minds. What punishment could possibly befit these monsters masquerading as humans? In the courtroom, the prosecution laid bare a disturbing narrative. Randy Roden, they argued, was not merely a caregiver who failed. He was the orchestrator of unimaginable cruelty. They painted him as a manipulative, sadistic man who preyed on a vulnerable family and left a trail of physical and emotional devastation in his wake. The timeline of events was obvious and undeniable. The prosecution presented a clear contrast between the children's lives before and after Randy moved in. Photos of Evangelina and her brothers from the summer of 2014 showed healthy, happy children. Evangelina with her wide smile and bright eyes, her brothers laughing and carefree. But after October, when Randy entered their lives, the pictures changed. The bruises started small, then multiplied. Evangelina's light dimmed as her injuries grew more severe, culminating in her tragic death in December. Evangelina didn't just fall off a toilet, the prosecutor declared, their voice shaking with restrained emotion. She was tortured. The jury saw photographs of Evangelina's bruises, bite marks, and missing fingernails, evidence that she had suffered not just neglect, but calculated violence. Witness after witness took the stand to corroborate the evidence, and neighbors testified about the sounds of screaming and crying that had emanated from the wing apartment. The prosecution didn't stop with the children's injuries, but they also went into Randy's past, exposing his history of domestic violence, manipulation, and control. Court records revealed a man who had repeatedly harmed women and children, a predator who hid behind charm and feigned compassion. The weight of the evidence was undeniable. However, Randy's defense team took a different approach, one that felt almost desperate in the face of such overwhelming evidence. They argued that Evangelina's death was not caused by abuse, but by an undetected staph infection that had led to sepsis. A pediatric forensic pathologist testified for the defense, claiming that the bacterial infection had spread to Evangelina's bloodstream, leading to organ failure. They suggested that the visible injuries on her body, including the bite marks and bruises, could have been symptoms of the infection rather than signs of abuse. But the defense's strategy went further. They aimed to shift the blame entirely onto Dorothy. Randy's attorneys portrayed her as a manipulative, neglectful mother who had a history of harming her children long before Randy arrived. They presented photographs of the children with minor injuries, claiming these were evidence of Dorothy's abuse. Randy, they argued, had merely been trying to help a struggling mother keep her family together. But the defense also challenged the prosecution's use of forensic odontology. They claimed the bite mark evidence, which pointed to Randy, was unreliable and had not been scientifically validated. They pressed the prosecution's expert on why certain tests hadn't been performed, attempting to sow doubt in the minds of the jury. But as compelling as their arguments might have sounded on paper, they faltered in the face of the prosecution's damning evidence. The injuries were too severe, too specific, to be explained away as infection or coincidence. The trial was a roller coaster of emotion. Medical experts and investigators spoke with measured voices, their professionalism barely masking the anguish they felt. One pediatrician, recounting the extent of the children's injuries, paused to collect herself, her voice trembling as she described the spiral fracture in Evangelina's arm. The jury, too, was visibly shaken. Several members turned away as graphic photos of Evangelina's body were displayed on screens in the courtroom. Others wiped away tears as they listened to recordings of the 5-year-old boy describing how he and his siblings had been chained like dogs in their home. But after weeks of testimony, the jury reached their decision. Randy Roden was found guilty of murder, manslaughter, assault, and criminal mistreatment. The sentence was heavy, 40 years in prison. But the story didn't end there. Years later, Randy's defense team appealed the conviction, arguing that the prosecution's bite mark evidence lacked scientific validity. To the outrage of the community, the Oregon Court of Appeals reduced Randy's sentence to just 20 years, a decision that left many feeling justice had been denied. Dorothy, who had struck a plea deal with prosecutors, pleaded guilty to manslaughter and criminal mistreatment. She received a 15-year sentence in exchange for testifying against Randy. While some saw her sentence as lenient given her role in the children's suffering, others viewed it as a necessary compromise to ensure Randy's conviction. When the details of Evangelina Wing's case came to light, the community of Seaside, Oregon, was left shaken and outraged. Neighbors who had once seen the children playing outside were haunted by guilt, wondering if they had missed the signs. The initial sentence of 40 years for Randy Roden provided some solace, but when it was reduced to 20 years following an appeal, the outrage reignited. "How could the court let this happen?" one neighbor lamented. "He tortured those kids, and now he gets to walk out of prison in just 2 decades. Legal experts criticized the reliance on bite mark evidence, which had been a central point of the appeal. "This case highlights a systemic issue in how we handle forensic evidence," one expert commented, "but that shouldn't overshadow the overwhelming proof of abuse." Dorothy Wing's plea deal, which granted her 15 years in exchange for her testimony, was equally polarizing. Some viewed it as a necessary compromise to ensure Randy's conviction, while others saw it as an insult to Evangelina's memory. 15 years isn't enough for a mother who stood by while her children were tortured, one activist declared during a community meeting. The case became a flashpoint for discussions about justice, accountability, and the failures that allowed the abuse to go unchecked. On the other hand, some legal experts argued that Dorothy's sentence was appropriate given her coerced and controlled circumstances. One criminal psychologist noted, "Victims of manipulation often feel powerless to act. Dorothy's role in this tragedy reflects both personal failure and the broader failure of a system that didn't intervene." This case opened up ethical discussions about plea deals in cases of child abuse. Is it worth reducing a sentence if it helps bring a perpetrator to justice, or does it undermine the severity of the crimes committed? The lack of a clear answer only added to the frustration surrounding the outcome of the case. Evangelina's brothers, aged 2 and 5 at the time of her death, were placed into protective custody after being removed from their mother's care. The physical scars of their abuse began to heal, but the emotional wounds ran deep. The boys were eventually relocated to California. Reports indicate that they received extensive therapy to help them process their trauma. A child psychologist who worked with the boys noted their resilience. They endured unimaginable pain, but they've shown incredible strength. They're slowly learning what it means to feel safe and loved. While their lives have improved, the shadow of their past remains. Advocates have used their story to push for better support systems for child survivors of abuse, emphasizing the importance of long-term care and stability. The case of Evangelina Wing highlighted glaring systemic failures that contributed to her death. One of the most pressing issues was the lack of oversight in Randy Roden's background. Despite his history of domestic violence and probation violations, he was able to move into Dorothy's home without raising any red flags. Child Protective Services had no prior contact with the family, leaving the children vulnerable to unchecked abuse. This was a failure at every level, said one child welfare advocate. From probation officers to neighbors to the judicial system, there were so many opportunities to intervene, and yet none were taken. The case also made the need for stricter background checks and better training for those who work with vulnerable families. Activists called for reforms to ensure that no child would slip through the cracks again. Evangelina's life was tragically short, but her story has left an indelible mark on the hearts of those who heard it. She was a little girl who loved to laugh, play with her brothers, and find joy in the simplest moments. Her death is a sobering reminder of how quickly innocence can be stolen when society turns a blind eye. Evangelina's story is one we should never forget. Her suffering must serve as a call to action, for all of us to be vigilant, to speak up, and to protect those who cannot protect themselves. How many more children must suffer? Every child deserves a safe and nurturing environment. Yet for far too many, their homes, the places meant to protect them, become the sites of unimaginable pain. The numbers behind child abuse are both staggering and sobering. Let's take a closer look at the statistics that reveal the true scope of this crisis. In 2022 alone, over 558,899 children in the United States were confirmed victims of abuse and neglect. That's nearly 8 out of every 1,000 children. The most common form of maltreatment? Neglect. It affects an overwhelming 74.3% of victims. Physical abuse and sexual abuse follow, but neglect itself often paves the way for deeper, long-term harm. These numbers are not just statistics, they represent real children. Every case hides a story of trauma that could have been prevented. The most heartbreaking reality of child abuse is the lives lost. In 2021, an estimated 1,820 children died due to abuse and neglect. That's 5 children every single day. Each one was a life full of potential, dreams extinguished because no one intervened in time. One of the biggest challenges in addressing child abuse is identifying it early. In 2022, there were over 4.3 million referrals to Child Protective Services, involving 7.5 million children. Of these, 3 million children received investigations or alternative responses. Despite these efforts, countless cases still go unnoticed, leaving vulnerable children trapped in dangerous environments. The scars of abuse don't fade once the abuse ends. For many survivors, the effects linger for a lifetime. Studies show that children who experience abuse or neglect are 9 times more likely to become involved in criminal activity later in life. About 80% of 21-year-olds who were abused as children meet the criteria for at least one psychological disorder. Think about that. 8 out of 10 young adults carrying the invisible weight of their trauma into adulthood. These statistics paint a sad picture, but they're not just numbers. They're a call to action. The question is, what can we do to change these outcomes? Together we can turn these heartbreaking numbers into stories of hope, recovery, and prevention. Every statistic we've shared represents a life, a child who needed someone to see, to care, and to act. Let us remember those who were failed by the system, and let their stories fuel our resolve to never let it happen again. And so we reach the conclusion of this disturbing story, a story marked by innocence lost, unimaginable cruelty, and lingering questions about justice. The tragic case of Evangelina Wing forces us to confront the darkest aspects of human nature, while reflecting on the systemic failures that allowed this to happen. Justice was served in the courtroom, but considering the reduced sentences and the lifelong scars left on Evangelina's surviving brothers, Can any punishment truly measure up to the horrors endured by these children? How do we as a society ensure no child slips through the cracks again? What could neighbors or community members have done differently to help prevent this tragedy? Do you think systemic reforms, like stricter background checks or better child welfare protocols, would make a difference? How can we as individuals remain vigilant against signs of child abuse and take action when needed? We'd love to hear your thoughts and opinions. Your voice matters in these important conversations. While you're here, don't forget to check out our other videos, like and subscribe to support our channel, and join us in shedding light on stories that must never be forgotten.
Don't forget to like the video. It helps bring more attention to these important cases. Take care and stay safe. See you in the next episode.